Count Dracula is, without a doubt, one of the most terrifying figures in modern pop culture. His mystical power, thirst for blood, and coffin slumber make ordinary mortals tremble. But how much of this portrayal aligns with reality? After all, the prototype for this sinister character was a real historical figure. Vlad III, also known as Vlad the Impaler or Vlad Dracula, the legendary voivode of Wallachia. It's said his reputation during his lifetime was so fearsome that it even surpassed Bram Stoker's fiction. What if you were a 19-year-old woman and you were given in marriage to this very Dracula? How did the real Vlad Dracula become so infamous that he inspired the vampire image? What was their wedding night like? Do vampires truly originate from Slavic mythology? And who was the first vampire to cause a genuine panic in 18th century Europe? How did vampires invade the USA in the 19th century? Why is Dracula revered as a saint in Romania? And which of his modern descendants are well known to all of us? Let's journey into the dark Transylvania with our heroine and discover what it was like to be married to Vlad Dracula. Support our channel. Before we delve into the mysterious world of Vlad Dracula, we want to thank everyone who has already supported our channel by purchasing a t-shirt, hoodie, or sweatshirt from our store. We want to personally thank each of you. Please send your name and order number. For those who haven't yet, we'd like to announce that due to the monetization being disabled in Russia, you can support us by buying the t-shirt of your dreams with a stylish print. Since we've reached 1 million subscribers, we're announcing a special offer. Any t-shirt for only 799 rubles. Hurry, this offer is for a limited time. We have a huge selection of prints on various themes, from games and cats to literature, music, and even avocados. If you still can't find what you're looking for, use our convenient designer to order an item with your own image. Buy one for yourself or as a gift for a loved one, and support our channel. The link will be in the description. Ilona's fate, marriage to a legend. Ilona, only 19, belongs to a noble Hungarian family. Her cousin is King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary himself. Unfortunately, this is more of a curse than a blessing, as the king makes all the important decisions in her life. It's 1475, and she is already a widow. At a young age, she was married to the influential aristocrat Wenceslaus Pogranik of St. Miklos, but he passed away. And now, her royal relative has announced his decision. Ilona will marry Vlad Dracula, whom the king recently recognized as the legitimate voivode of Wallachia. Ilona nearly fainted at the news, and for good reason. At that time, Vlad Dracula was already around 45 years old, and by that age he had become a truly legendary figure. The young bride, raised at court, was, of course, well aware of all the horrifying gossip about him. She was an extremely devout girl, and everything she heard about her future husband terrified her. The real Vlad III's gruesome reputation. In short, everything that makes Count Dracula famous, as imagined by Bram Stoker, seems trivial compared to the biography of the real Vlad III. Even during his lifetime, books with legends of his sadistic inclinations and bloodthirst spread throughout Europe. He was known as a prominent warrior, but everyone was also aware of his incredible cruelty and vindictiveness. His enemies, especially the Turks, desperately feared him. At court, people whispered that Dracula loved to dip his bread in the blood of his enemies during dinner. It was also said that he had a peculiar sense of humor. Allegedly, while observing people impaled on stakes, he found it amusing how they twitched on the poles like frogs, exclaiming, "Oh, what great grace they show!" They said he enjoyed dining under the bodies of those impaled on stakes, and when a servant attending him at dinner nearly fainted from the stench of decaying bodies, Dracula ordered him to be placed on the highest stake, saying, "Now this stench of decay won't reach you." Courtiers also recounted that this bloodthirsty monster would burn beggars with whom he might dine. Ambassadors who did not remove their hats when meeting him were ordered to have their hats nailed to their heads. He forced parents to eat their own children. Unfaithful wives in his domain had their genitals cut out and their skin flayed. It was also told that his subjects feared their hospiter so much that a golden chalice stood unguarded in the town square, from which anyone could drink, and yet no one ever dared to steal it. All these stories, told in the palace during strolls to pass the time, chilled Ilona's blood. And now she was being offered in marriage to this monster. She had also seen a gruesome book about Vlad Dracula, with terrifying miniatures titled, "About the villain who was called Dracula and was voivode of Wallachia." This is what Ilona read in it. "And of the people from the lords who were accustomed to tyrannizing their subjects everywhere since the world was created, and of the most wicked beasts of all time, as far as I know, I will tell in verses how the dragon raged, ruled Wallachia, and lured his fate to strengthen his sins." She remembered how everyone sighed with relief that this monster had been imprisoned for 13 years, unexpectedly placed there by King Corvinus, supposedly for secret negotiations with the Ottoman Empire. And now she was to marry him. Medieval marriages and the plight of women. According to the custom of betrothal in noble families, the king commissioned a portrait of Dracula, painted in prison. It's unlikely that a man from this portrait could captivate a girl. Alas, in the Middle Ages, being a woman meant having no say. Being in essence a walking womb meant only to bear children. Daughters could be married off from the age of 12 and betrothed from as young as 7. Princesses, however, were married even younger. The absolute record holder was Bianca Sforza, who married at 2 and was a widow by 10. It was extremely difficult to avoid marriage. If a daughter outright refused to marry her parents' chosen suitor, they could even arrange for their own daughter's rape by letting the groom into her bedroom. Typically, a bride spoiled in this way had no choice but to agree to marry her violator. A husband could cheat, beat, or send his wife to a convent, but a woman was obligated only to endure. She was entirely at his mercy, for marriage and childbirth were a woman's sole purpose, with no personal development whatsoever. Dissolving an unhappy marriage to a hated husband was virtually impossible. It required proving in court that the marriage was contracted by deception, that the spouses were blood relatives, that the husband was impotent, or that he treated his wife with extreme cruelty. Note that moderate cruelty was even approved. A wife, they said, needed to be taught. But even the death of a disliked spouse did not free a woman. She was either forced to remarry to avoid destitution, or if she inherited a large fortune from her husband, she was compelled to remarry. For instance, in 12th century England, all wealthy widows were entered into the treasury register, and the king could distribute them to his subjects at his discretion and for his own benefit. A widow had only one chance to avoid remarriage, to buy her way out of this register. However, this pleasure was so expensive that a woman had to pay all her inherited wealth for it. She would then become impoverished, and this time she would have to marry to be supported. Our heroine had no chance of avoiding marriage to the fearsome Vlad Dracula. However, relatives recalled that her father had dealings with Dracula and knew him personally, not just from gossip, pamphlets, or anecdotes. They said that in reality, he had no horns and seemed like a normal person. Dracula's poor bride, after weeping, began to prepare for the wedding. A medieval wedding and the consummation of marriage. A medieval wedding was a lavish and crowded event. At Ilona and Dracula's wedding, there were many gifts, feasts, wandering musicians, and of course, guests who sympathized with the girl marrying such a monster. Dracula's bride was not dressed in white, but in red, as was customary. The clergy at the altar solemnized their marriage. Then they went to church where they took vows and received blessings. After that came another crucial ritual, the consummation of the marriage. The wedding night was meant to be public, with witnesses who would close the bed curtains and wait for the marriage to be completed. Physical contact had to be attested to. The consummation of marriage was an important fact, especially for aristocratic families. Experienced ladies or female relatives were often left by the young couple's bedside to offer advice. Everything related to sex, including the wedding night, was controlled by the church in the Middle Ages. For instance, the church strictly forbade sexual relations between spouses on 4 days: Wednesdays, Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. For intimacy with one's own husband on a Sunday, both could be condemned to bread and water for 40 days. You might ask, how would the priests know about this? Well, the spouses themselves were simply obliged to confess it. It was also forbidden on numerous church holidays and fast days, totaling no less than 240 days a year. There were other prohibitions. Intimacy was strictly allowed only during the dark hours of the day. In the Middle Ages, it was believed that women were far more lustful than men, which was why they needed strict supervision. By marrying, a woman gained a significantly higher status in medieval society than an unmarried woman. She now oversaw the household, bore heirs, and fulfilled her marital duties. After the wedding, which Ilona barely remembered due to her anxiety, she and her new husband traveled to Transylvania, to Dracula's castle. Now she was to find herself alone, entirely at his mercy. Her imagination was already painting pictures of people impaled on stakes, under which she would have to dine, and other horrors. Dracula's castle and the true face of Vlad III. Today, many castles in Transylvania claim to be where Vlad Dracula lived, but most of them were built after his death. It's known that the famous hospodar was unpretentious in his daily life and disliked luxury. He spent his entire life on military campaigns. His castle was an extremely uncomfortable place, much like other medieval castles. They were very cold and damp. The castle was exposed to all winds, and drafts swept through the corridors. Heating and lighting the entire place were virtually impossible. However, Ilona found beautiful furniture and dishes in the castle. To her relief upon arrival, her husband did not immediately rush to impale anyone. They did not dine under the bodies of the executed, and he apparently did not drink the blood of his enemies. Upon arrival, he immediately surrounded himself with priests and monks. Ilona began to observe her husband more closely. At the mention of Dracula, we all imagine someone like this or this. What the real Vlad III actually looked like is unknown today. His earliest depictions were caricatures, though created during his lifetime, and their purpose was to blacken Vlad III's name. This is considered his earliest depiction. Here he is shown as Pontius Pilate about to judge Christ. And in this contemporary depiction from the Wilton Monastery, he is tormenting Apostle Andrew I called. The purpose of these images was to discredit Vlad III. However, the most reliable portrait, according to scholars, is this one, housed in an Austrian castle. Although it's later, it's a copy of an earlier, unpreserved portrait painted, so to speak, from life during the famous hospodar's time. And it is this lost portrait, scholars believe, that was painted when Dracula was in prison for Ilona. It also forms the basis of this miniature, which is kept in the Vienna Museum of Art History. In short, he was not a sinister monster. Vlad III's name and origins. Debunking myths. Vlad III indeed came from a noble family, but he was never a Count Dracula. It was Bram Stoker, who wrote his famous novel in the late 19th century, who embellished things a bit for dramatic effect. Both Dracula and Tepes are nicknames. His family's real surname was Basarab. Vlad's exact birth date is not established, but it was somewhere between 1429 and 1436. Incidentally, the house where he was born still stands in Romania today. Tourists are also shown a 15th century fresco there, which supposedly depicts Dracula's parents. There's nothing sinister about his nickname Dracul either. Vlad inherited it from his father, who was a knight of the Order of the Dragon. This order was founded in 1408 by Sigismund, the Holy Roman Emperor, to fight for the purity of the Christian faith. All its knights wore medallions or pendants with a golden dragon curled into a ring. Upon receiving such a medallion, Dracula's father, when he became the ruler of Wallachia in 1436, placed this dragon on his coins, on his seal, and even on his heraldic shield. This is how the nickname, with which his son would enter history, came about. Vampires. From Slavic myths to European panic. However, his compatriots did not consider Dracula a vampire. They didn't even know the word vampire. The word vampire comes from the Old Slavic upir. Yes, prepare to be surprised. Scholars believe that the vampires we know today, who drink human blood, originated from Slavic folklore. They are mentioned in Slavic literature since the 14th century. The legends of vampires flourished most vividly not in Transylvania, but in Serbia. In Transylvania, these creatures are actually called strigoi. During Vlad Dracula's lifetime, no one particularly feared vampires. The real obsession with these creatures began much later, in the 18th century. At that time, Eastern Europe was gripped by a true panic. In 1721, two famous cases of vampire attacks in a village occurred in Serbia. Both stories were investigated by state officials, and many documents about them have been preserved. In one Serbian village, a deceased person returned 2 weeks after burial and asked his son for food. The son refused and was found dead. Then 8 more neighbors died from blood loss, telling before their deaths that the deceased had visited them and drunk their blood. An official named Frombold, to whom the villagers complained, ordered the grave to be opened in the presence of a priest. The frightened people saw the undisturbed body of the ghoul, which they then burned. The mysterious deaths in the village ceased after that. The second famous vampire was Arnold Palm. After his death, his fellow villagers began to die en masse, and the survivors said that Paolo was hunting them. The authorities opened his grave, found a perfectly preserved body and a coffin full of blood, after which they pierced the ghoul with a stake and burned it. However, vampire attacks in this village resumed 6 years later. After 12 people died on January 12, 1731, an Austrian doctor named Glasser arrived in the village of Medveja. At first, he tried to explain the deaths by natural causes, but when the villagers insisted on exhumation, he was shocked. Many of the bodies had not decomposed. The doctor called for reinforcements, a commission of military surgeons led by Johann Fluckinger. He conducted an investigation and found that almost half of those who died from vampires had not decomposed. At his order, all the restless deceased were pierced with stakes and burned. After the story of the vampire Paolo, a real hysteria swept across Europe. Cases of vampire attacks began to be recorded outside Serbia, and it was even suggested that a quarantine zone be established around Serbia. An entire generation lived in wild fear of vampires. Peasants massively dug up graves and drove stakes into the deceased. In 1749, all the information collected by the authorities was published by the respected French scholar and theologian Antoine Calmet in his treatise. Here's what a state official who visited the epicenter of the vampire epidemic told him. In these parts, it is considered quite common to encounter a person who died some time ago. This person returns to the village, sits at the table with his acquaintances without saying a word, and signals with his head to one of those present, who inevitably dies a few days later. The Austrian Empress Maria Theresa was forced to send her personal doctor John van Swieten to investigate the matter. He traveled there and wrote an entire treatise, an inquiry into the existence of ghosts, in which he concluded that vampires do not exist. After that, the Empress forbade opening graves and desecrating bodies. Thus, the vampire epidemic ended, but the legends of vampires continued to live on. Vampires in New England and the vampire syndrome. Debunked. The next vampire epidemic erupted in the 19th century in New England, on the east coast of the USA. People believed that vampires were attacking them and drinking their blood. Farming families dug up their deceased to decapitate them and then burn their remains. The most famous story is associated with 19-year-old Mercy Brown. She was called the last of the vampires of Ilona's lineage. She died in 1882, and 2 months later, her father and the family doctor exhumed her body and gasped. There was dried blood on her lips, and she was lying on her side, not as she had been. Placed in the coffin, her heart was cut out and burned. Farmers listed among the symptoms of the mysterious vampire epidemic gray skin, dripping from the mouth, blood, and sunken eyes. However, today scientists believe that these symptoms are very similar to those of tuberculosis, and the blood dripping from the mouth was a result of coughing. These events, it is believed, gave rise to the terrifying fear of vampires in modern culture. Ilona and Vlad, family life, and the true story of a hero. Meanwhile, Ilona's life slowly began to settle down. Her husband turned out to be a peaceful man in domestic life, and also extremely religious. And in this, they found common ground. She discovered that her husband supported Wallachian Orthodox monasteries and even founded a new one, built a church, and engaged in charity. His subjects loved him and were devoted to him. Incidentally, there is a version that it was because of Ilona that Dracula broke up with his first wife, who drowned herself near the Poenari fortress as a result. However, other historians say that the story of the drowned woman is merely a legend recorded by a folklore researcher in 1969, and it's not entirely clear who drowned. Whether it was one of Dracula's wives or his daughter, or even a peasant woman who did not want to fall into the hands of the Turks. However, according to another version, he did have a first wife named Elizabeth, who was the illegitimate daughter of the previous Hungarian king with whom Vlad had fought. His first wife Elizabeth supposedly bore him a son named Minia, nicknamed the Evil, and then died. However, only Ilona's existence is reliably known. Gradually, she learned her husband's true story from him. Vlad Dracula was a true knight of the Order of the Dragon, a celebrated warrior who considered the defense of orthodoxy and the creation of a unified state the mission of his life. That is why the prototype of Dracula is now a saint revered by the Romanian Church. There he is a national hero. His opponents, even his younger brother, expended enormous effort and money to transform this celebrated commander, brave warrior, and talented ruler into a fantastical villain and bloodsucker during his lifetime. Torrents of monstrous lies spread throughout the world were poured on him, a true information war that the brave warrior lost to cunning villains, thus remaining in history as the greatest villain. When he was very young, Dracula's father seized the Wallachian throne at the will of the King of Hungary. Then he quarreled with the king and lost the throne, and then began the struggle to regain that lineage with the help of the Ottoman Sultan. As a result, his two sons, Vlad, who was then 13 or 14 years old, and his younger brother Radu, became hostages of the Sultan, so that Dracula's father would be, so to speak, a reliable partner. Many researchers believe that it was here in Turkey that he experienced the strongest psychological shock. This occurred, according to one version, after he was tortured in the Ottoman Empire to convert to Islam. On the other hand, historical sources say nothing about this. And according to another popular hypothesis, Dracula received the strongest shock when the heir to the Ottoman throne, Mehmed the Semongan, began to harass his younger brother. A medieval Greek historian writes about Mehmed II being in love with Dracula's brother, Radu the Handsome. In general, the life of two young defenseless hostages at court was certainly not easy. And then something truly terrible happened. In 1447, Dracula's father was overthrown from the throne by the Hungarians with the support of local boyars. His head was cut off, and his older brother Mircea was blinded with red-hot iron rings and buried alive. The Ottoman Sultan, upon learning of Dracula's father's death, declared a new war on the Hungarians, and a year later placed the 25-year-old Vlad on the throne, while keeping his younger brother Radu, his lover, at his court. But once in power, Vlad refused to pay tribute to the Turks and became the most uncompromising fighter against the Ottomans. He strengthened the country's defenses with a ring of fortresses, developed trade, pursued a protectionist policy, mercilessly fought traitors, aristocrats, elevating obscure but loyal people. And after that, he launched a campaign against the Turks, inflicting a crushing defeat on them. Legends began to form about the exploits and battles of the young Dracula. But when the Turks went to avenge themselves on tiny Wallachia, his allies betrayed him and offered no help. Vlad's tiny army of about 30,000 men was left alone against 150,000 Turkish forces. Then he made a brilliant move, anticipating Kutuzov's tactics. His warriors, retreating into the mountains, burned all crops in their homeland and poisoned wells. The Turkish army suffered terribly along the way, and at the end they found the abandoned capital of Wallachia with open gates. There was not a single living soul, only captured Turks impaled on stakes, and a terrible, suffocating stench. The Ottomans were terrified and hastened to leave, and at night Dracula's warriors attacked them. The once invincible Turks fled in disgrace. Incidentally, his younger brother Radu, whom the Turkish Sultan wanted to place on the Wallachian throne, was with them. Thus Vlad III achieved another incredible victory, and the hammer of the Turks became a topic of conversation throughout Europe. The information war and Dracula's descendants. And that's when he was betrayed again. First, a friend, the King of Moldavia, whom Vlad had helped conquer the throne, allied with his younger brother and the Turks. And when Vlad turned to the Hungarian king, Ilona's cousin, he, for everyone's surprise, treacherously arrested Dracula and accused the main anti-Turkish fighter in the Balkans of conspiring with them. This is what a contemporary, the author of the Hungarian Chronicle, writes with surprise. The king crossed the Alps, as they say, in order to free Dracula from the hands of the Turks. Arriving there, he, for unknown reasons, since no one fully understood it, seized Dracula in Transylvania, and he confirmed Radu, who had been appointed to that province by the Turks, contrary to all expectations. This Dracula was brought to Buda as a prisoner and held for 10 years in captivity. Such were his allies. After Vlad's arrest, Radu the Handsome, the Turkish Sultan's beloved, who had converted to Islam, took the Wallachian throne, and launched an information war against his brother in 1464. He published a book about Dracula, which created a new bloodthirsty image of the valiant hero of yesterday. It contained the most gruesome fabrications and terrifying miniatures. The book was printed in large numbers and distributed worldwide, showing how a brave warrior became a sadist and bloodthirsty monster. Incidentally, the nickname Tepe, which translates from Romanian as the Impaler, was not used during Vlad III's lifetime at all. It appeared 30 years after his death. Our compatriot, Fyodor Kurutsyn, a clerk of the Russian embassy, who was then at King Matthias Corvinus's court on an official visit, also contributed to the creation of the sinister legend of Dracula. Several years after Vlad's death, he published his Tale of Dracula the Voivode. The creation of the legends was finally completed in the late 19th century when Bram Stoker penned his Dracula, taking the bloodthirsty monster who entered history as the first vampire. Vlad and Ilona's relationship improved. She had long been considered childless because she had no children in her first marriage. But in her marriage to Dracula, Ilona, who had lost hope, gave birth to 2 sons, one of whom she named after her husband, Vlad. However, Dracula continued to spend most of his time on military campaigns. He died in 1476. Medieval chroniclers Jacob André and Lucas believe he was killed by his servant, who was bribed by the Turks. Ilona was married again. No one knows what she thought about this. First, she married a certain Pavel Shchuka, and after his death, Rainer Halle of Transylvania. Ilona died in 1497. She had no children from her other husbands. You might be surprised, but the descendants of that very Vlad Dracula are alive today and well known to all of you. These are the heirs to the British throne, King Charles III and Prince William, and even Queen Elizabeth II herself. To quote King Charles, "Transylvanian blood runs in my veins. According to my family tree, I am descended from Vlad III the Impaler." In the 19th century, British King George VI married Mary of Teck, who was a direct descendant of Vlad IV, Tepes's brother. Scholars have calculated that King Charles is Dracula's descendant in the 16th generation. However, he himself stated that he is not afraid of his bloodthirsty relative and has even bought a small house in a Romanian village.